Tonight on Drive Theory, it is all about audio. We actually bring in a guest with a doctorate in music composition to talk to us about how sound works and how it's more of a slinky and not a, well, I've already forgotten what it is, but you'll know what it is soon tonight on Drive Theory. We talk about why engines sound good, why some sound bad, what makes an engine sound like anything. We talk the fundamental notes, the harmonics, the little intonations, about all of it. It's a really technical episode. It's a really long episode, but I think it's a really good one. Welcome to Drive Theory.
Close your eyes and open up your ears, and then open your eyes again, because this is a video podcast. It's car time.
All right, try to follow that one up, Jared.
There's no way. Let's take you Sound Town to car time.
Back on the train.
So if you're new to Drive Theory, if you found us from our last podcast episode from the preview video, welcome. We've gotten not a whole lot, but a lot to us, more viewers and listeners from the past two podcasts than we have before. And so to formally introduce myself, my name is Isaac. That's Tony. We're the two normal guys that we just kind of waffle on about cars, and every now and then we do something a little bit more high effort. So today we're going to be getting into something really fun. That is something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time, and that is the musicality of engines. That is like, why do some things sound pleasing to your ears and other things don't, and why groups of people like the way some engines sound, even to where it's a generational thing, where people will be like, oh yeah, my dad just loved the sound of a big block Chevy, or it's just like, oh yeah, I love the sound when early in the morning you hear a V12 going by, and so this is going to be a really technical episode. We're going to get really nerdy, and to do that we need the help of someone with a doctorate. And so we have Dr. Jared Tubbs with us today. Introduce yourself whenever you are ready, sir.
Oh yeah, well yeah, I'm technically doctor. I just got my doctorate. My name's Jared Tubbs. I got my past pretty much all three: bachelor, master's, and doctorate in music composition. I did one at the University of Alabama, my second one my master's at the Western Michigan University, and my doctorate at the University of Georgia, which is where I'm at right now. So the background is actually a studio in the Dance Center for New Music at the University of Georgia. But yeah, so
you're in Athens.
Yes, in Athens, which as somebody who was raised in Tuscaloosa, can be a contentious subject from some of the Bulldog fans. But I tell them we both dislike Auburn, and generally that dissuades any violence. But yeah, so technically I can say my music's been played across the United States. It's just been top and bottom instead of side to side. Yeah, that's pretty much my background here, or in music. And I'm really interested in my own research and creative output is a lot around algorithmic music and generative music systems and sound installations. But I'm really interested in music technology as a whole, and exploring that and seeing how that ends up, or what kind of things can be done with it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So you were on a car podcast. So I know that we don't normally talk about sound and stuff like that, but we really needed an expert opinion on what sound is, and how do people react to it? How does it work? How does sound move? Stuff like that. And I want to ask, as sort of like an icebreaker or whatever, what is as someone who has told me before that you're not necessarily a big car guy, and you are in a podcast with two big car guys, what's your impression of car culture and in general, and what's your perspective on, maybe not so much on a sound perspective, but maybe how does it relate to what you do?
Yeah, my general, or whenever my initial thoughts of this question are really based on what's going on right now, which is that Kendrick Lamar just a week ago released GNX, and honestly, not being a car guy, the first thing I did when I saw the title, I was like, okay, what is a GNX?
Yeah.
And so I Googled it, and yeah, okay, a Grand National experimental, and so learning a little bit more about that, and it makes me think a lot about how kind of car culture is at least partially ingrained in a lot of music culture, especially West Coast rap and hip hop,
Mm-hmm.
and as well as in general in music production, when people are creating new tracks and they want to put it to the test. I think they have something good. It's a common thing to call it. They call it the whip test, where you bring it into a car and you hear how it sounds in your car's stereo. And if it sounds bad in a stereo, that's where most people are listening to it. So they need to make sure that sounds good, or at least in the same way it needs to sound good on like Beats headphones or AirPods or stuff. It's just the main medium of communication compared to like really fancy speakers. Not everyone has those. So
Absolutely.
that's definitely what my first thoughts are. Mostly with like, I respect car culture. I just don't really have as much. I haven't had the chance to mess around with it as much or to be a part of it as much so far.
It's funny. It's funny you mentioned that, because like as someone who like is in music composition and you're kind of on the bleeding edge of where music is going and you know a lot about it and stuff, it's so interesting because there's so much music that is touched by and made by people who love cars. Like you can't throw a rock and without hitting or bouncing off of a song that has a little red Corvette, or an Impala, or
All I ever wanted was a black Grand National.
yeah, there is just myriad of examples. Like even Chris Stapleton talked about his 911 in his recent album, and it's so interesting because it's with a cultural phenomenon like cars and car cultures, and a uniquely really American car culture in that. It's so interesting to hear how that subtext of what people are interested going into making music, which is a part of them, not a part of their music, becomes a part of their music, and you're now testing it out in a car where most people are going to listen to it to begin with. And so that's very cool to me.
Music is music is art, and art is a reflection of culture, and cars are really important in American culture just because of kind of the way we've built things, and they can be status symbols. Especially, I think that's like, from my understanding, like with a lot of rap, it's a status symbol to say you have like a black Grand National, or like the thing you wanted. And so it makes sense that it kind of ties in and everything.
I mean, they're on album covers, they're in
Yeah.
music videos.
Mm-hmm.
It's just cool. It's a very cool thing to see, and a huge and integral part. So I'm a really kind of an old school guy. We're coming into 2025 at the time of this recording, and as far as old school comparatively to the previous 10 years of innovations with cars and stuff. So I work a lot with in the EV space, and one thing that is bereft of EVs, which is a huge part of a car experience to me, is sound. And not every car has to be manual, and I kind of can see that, even though I think just about everything I've got is manual, and not everything has to be gas, even though everything that I have and probably will have is gas. But I was thinking a lot about, like what part of the soul of a car experience is lost when you lose sound. And and you really have to look at, so what is, not only do you have to look at, before we can say, okay, let's dig into why does one car sound different from the other car, because obviously something like a Miata is not going to sound the same as something like a Charger or a Challenger, and they're, of course, the simple, at face value, you can look at it and say like, oh yes, this is engine size, one has more cylinders than the other, but what does that mean? But before we can understand that, we really need to understand how sound works. What is sound? Is sound something that moves? Is it something like a light ray? Like, Jared, what is sound?
Yeah, I always think the question is fun because it's one of those things where it's like what is vision or what is sight? It's something that we kind of experience, but it's not, our experience is just our perspective on like a physical phenomena, I guess. Sound is vibration of a medium of any kind. So generally we understand it as vibration of air molecules, because that's where we hear it, because air is vibrating and that vibrates in our eardrums, and our brain interprets that as sound and music. But it can be anything. Like really, it can be through physical media. So for example, if you like, have you ever heard like the old tales of like, you can hear trains coming sooner if you put your ear to the ground? That's because sound can travel faster through a more solid medium such as ground instead of air, and that's why you can hear it sooner, or especially low frequencies and stuff like that. But yeah, so that's what sound is vibration of a medium of any kind. The way we understand it is through vibration of air. How sound appears to us, it's kind of, our ears are very specifically designated to hear any frequencies from 20 hertz to 20,000 kilohertz. With a hertz,
Jeez.
we can think of sound when we say sound waves. That's because we generally view sound on like a graph as like a little wave going up and down. When really, it's not actually how sound is. It doesn't go up and down. It actually squeezes into being really compressed air molecules and really loose air molecules, which are called
What?
compressions and rarefactions. It's really
like a slinky.
exactly like a slinky. A slinky is the best possible. Like I use that in classes when I teach people about sound. I'm like, yes, don't think of it as like a wave going up and down. Think of it as like a slinky pushing in and out, and
It's like a concertina effect.
yeah. So yeah, it's these compressions and rarefactions, and the amount of times air is compressed and rarefacted over any period, um, is we measure that in hertz, which is cycles. So cycles of being compressed, then rarefacted, then back to normal per second. And so we can hear once something begins to cycle between squished and unsquished 20 times in a second, we can start hearing it up to possibly when it squishes and unsquishes 20,000 times a second. That being said, that's like that's a newborn's hearing. A newborn's hearing is from 20 hertz to 20,000 kilohertz probably. You immediately start losing that as soon as you're born. And it gets worse if you listen to
When you're born, you can see really bad and hear really good.
Yes, maybe that's part of the reason why babies cry so much. I don't know, but
You can hear everything. Shut up.
the too many high frequencies, like really like the mosquito tone that used to be really popular, that's probably getting up near like 10,000, 12,000 hertz. There's 8,000 above that. And so it's always fun to do. I do this in my classes. I do a test of like, I play a frequency that goes all the way from 20 to 20,000 hertz. And I get students to raise their hands when they stop hearing anything. And generally it's like around 18,000 or so, maybe. It's been a while since I've done it, but fun thing to test at home if you ever want to.
Yeah, that does sound like a fun thing to test out. Something none of us have been. I guess you could go online and just like find like a noisemaker and set the actual the actual frequency, but I would never think to do that. This explanation of sound is blowing my whole perspective out of the water right now. We did not talk about this before the podcast or anything. If you ask me, I'd be like, yeah, it's wiggly air. It's a parabolic chart. It's parabolic wave. But it's not a wave. What is a sound wave then?
Well, yeah, it is a wave, but it's instead of when we think of like the waves we see on graphs, those are longitudinal waves. And these are called transverse waves. Or I think I might have that backwards. Let me double check. Yeah, I had that flipped. It is transverse waves are the up and down ones we normally think of. Longitudinal waves are the squish and unsquish. And even more uniquely, I guess you could say, is that sound wave, when we think of like a slinky, that's saying it's very directed, but sound doesn't really work in a very specific laser kind of way. It's spheres of things. So it's more like spheres of things squishing and unsquishing. And we just hear it in one particular direction because our ears are built to be able to kind of direct things in. So that's generally what sound is. When we move into like the music of things, and when we consider things to be, how we consider music to be and frequencies and stuff, that's where the hertz stuff comes in. But it's also it's where things get more complicated. Like when I say like you can hear 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, rarely is a sound ever going to be just one frequency at a time. It's only on those tests, little sine wave sweep things that test your hearing, that you hear those individual things. Mostly, for example, voices and engines and everything, they're all combinations of a bunch of different frequencies kind of either clashing together to make new ones, or beating up against each other, or just outweighing each other in terms of volume. And so it's the combination of all those things all together that makes things. The word we use in the music world is timbre, which is to say the tone color of a sound. So the reason, like, if a flute is playing a note versus a piano playing a note, we generally can understand the differences between those two because of their timbre, the different frequencies that are present even when they're trying to play the same note. Or if I were to sing a note versus either of y'all singing a note, other than people's obvious preferences, then it would be something like that. So So that's the kind of the idea of the timbre, and we have specific devices and algorithms to help break apart those sounds. There's this mathematical concept called a fast Fourier transform that helps us. That's basically how we get into being able to diagnose sound and find all of its individual frequencies today.
Oh, that's so interesting.
But all of that complexity is kind of what makes the sound unique, and the little complexities within that is where we get the idea of something sounding warm versus everything else. It's based on those or bright versus dark. All of that is all hidden within those kinds of sounds.
That's so interesting, man. And that's an excellent segue too, because really what I'm excited to dig into today is the different sources of timbre, if I'm using that correctly, from engines. So in automobile engines, there are no two engines that are completely alike. Even if you get the same engine, one may have different mileage, one may have different wear on their piston rings, and that might cause something kind of different. One may have a bad lifter, and that might cause an interesting sound. There are typically, for an automobile on the road today and for the past 100 years, which, by the way, I learned when I was doing research for this podcast, that cars are 17 years older than airplanes. And like, that's so close together. I did not know that. And because I think when I think about how far airplanes have come since their inception, I am blown away at how far that technology goes. And I'm not saying that we can take a car to the moon, but the fact that cars have come...
Can't take an airplane to the moon either.
That's an excellent point. I haven't thought about that. But anyways, I was thinking about that. So your typical piston engine vehicle, and I have to specify that because there are non-piston engines that are in vehicles on the road today. Not very many, but there are some. There are typically a four-stroke engine. A four-stroke engine is it is intake or induction, compression, combustion, and exhaust. Or, Tony, how would you simplify that?
Suck, squeeze, bang, blow.
So you suck the air in, you squeeze the air and compress it with a air fuel ratio. You ignite the air, and that pushes the piston down, and then you expel the bad, like the spent ratio or whatnot, out of the exhaust. And that inertia provided from the explosion is what pushes the piston down, and you have different pistons moving up and down, and that spins a crankshaft, and that is what gives your engine power. So if your engine is spinning, if it is on at all, then it is creating explosions every single second at many times per second. So an engine is running if the crankshaft is turning. That's the biggest thing you need to know. I'm sure a lot of you viewers watching know this. This is just kind of the basics before we get into the specifics. So basically, when you have a four-stroke engine, the fundamental note is that crankshaft movement, is that crankshaft rotation. And then, so if you have an RPM gauge, if you see something, you idle at like 500 RPM, and then when you're driving, you're at 2,300 or 3,000 RPM, that is revolutions per minute. So, this, in a four-stroke engine, this process means that each cylinder gets one ignition every other stroke. So a four-cylinder engine has two ignitions in one engine revolution, which makes your second exhaust note an octave higher than your fundamental note. So you have your fundamental note, and then you have your secondary note. And your fundamental note is, again, your crankshaft turning, and your secondary note is the RPM at which that engine is turning. So, Jared, can you explain what a fundamental note is and what a secondary note is?
Yeah. So when we talk about, and this is definitely tied in with the idea of timbre that I mentioned earlier. When we're talking about fundamental notes, it's that note that any instruments are playing that I mentioned earlier. So when we try and determine the difference between like what a flute sounds like versus a clarinet versus an engine, that if we were to tune an engine to the same note that a flute is playing or whatever, and then have them both make their noise, then they are going to, since they're using the same basic note, their same like building block note that all of the other their timbre is built off of, that's the fundamental note. And that's how we kind of dissect the things that come off, or the things that are above it. The notes above it, we consider the general term we'll use is like overtones, is because they're tones that are taking place over the fundamental note.
Okay.
And harmonics are often a kind of overtone. Generally, and it's really, harmonics are really important to music, because that's how like, this is from all the way back in Greek times with like Pythagoras. This is how we determine how violins play their notes and how stringed instruments play their notes.
Oh,
because it's all ratios, and that's so. For example, with a fundamental frequency of like, there's a tuning note that most orchestras or different instruments will use, which is 440 hertz, and that's an A. For those of for anyone who's looking forward to like what the exact note is in music or whatever. And so let's say at 440 hertz, that's the fundamental tone or the fundamental frequency. Then if we double that, that's an octave, which is to say that's the first time, if we're moving up a musical scale, first time we reach that same musical note again, except now it's a higher pitch, but it's the same because it's almost the same wavelength. It's just twice as fast hertz wise.
Mm-hmm.
It will sound like an A to our ears, like the same pitch.
Okay.
And so that doubling is an octave, and it's also the first harmonic of what we call a harmonic series for that note. Octaves are always the double of the last octave that happens. So for A equals 440, the next octave would be 880, and then the next octave after that would be 1760. The next octave after that would be 3520, and so forth. The difference between that and a harmonic series is just multiples. So for A equals 440, the next harmonic would be 440 times 2, which is 880, which is also the octave. Okay. The next one would be 440 times 3, which is 1320.
Oh, that's so
which is now
yeah.
exactly halfway between the octave and then the next octave. Musically, we generally designate that as like a perfect fifth. If you were to Google like musical harmonic series and see the notes on a staff, you'd see an octave and then a fifth and then a fourth, but a fifth plus a fourth in a musical note is an octave. And then it'll keep getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Because the higher frequency you get, the harder it is to tell pitch. I mean, you have to work harder to get to the next like octave or to get to hear the differences in pitch. This is why like most of our, again, like everything past 10,000 hertz gets really annoyingly high pitched to us pretty much.
This is insane.
So, yeah.
This is three levels of education at work hitting you in the face right now.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't even know what sound was, bro.
I thought I knew what sound was. I don't know the first thing about sound.
No, you know things. You have an intuition about what sound is, and then all the extra stuff is stuff like, you could probably, I mean, anyone who isn't tone deaf can sing an octave above the note, like the same note, just an octave higher. Okay. We know we intuit how to go high and low with our voices. It's just we don't need to know that we're like tuning up our throats to be able to like have things vibrate 2 times as fast or whatever.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense.
And yeah, so
if I say something and someone and my wife doesn't hear me and I need to say it louder, then I'm going 440 hertz.
Volume. That's volume.
That's volume totally different.
I guess I did. Volume is also a thing to think about, but and
so if I wanted to be sarcastic and annoying, I say it in a higher pitched voice.
I guess it depends on what your sarcastic voice sounds like, but maybe.
His sarcastic voice sounds like his impression of my voice. I'm not even joking.
That's me going.
Like, we were working on his car. Like, what was this, 5 or 6 years ago? At this point, this almost.
It's like 5 years ago.
We were rapping.
I was like. I don't know. It was like I was trying to get to his phone to stop playing music or something because we were wrapping my car and we had to communicate something, and I was like, "Hey Siri, stop playing this song," and then it didn't understand me obviously because it's his phone. So I went, "Hey Siri, stop playing this this song." I added some nasal overtones to it. Sorry, I'm not a.
No, that does the job.
The bad part was that it worked.
It worked. It worked.
I mean,
oh my god, I will never not be upset about that. But it's so interesting that you say that because it's the same thing. It's like, okay, so people intuitively understand some things about sound, and it's the same thing with engine sound. You may not think about the fact that your engine is at 1,000 RPM, so it's making 1,000 revolutions per minute. So it's making a certain amount of explosions every single second that you're in the car. But people know that the car is moving and the engine is running and stuff like that. And so I think it's a similar thing so segue back into this is that so as I said before, every other stroke kind of thing in the four stroke, same as what I said earlier. 6-cylinder engines, for example, have 3 ignitions per engine revolution. 8 cylinders have 4, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you bring a GR Corolla, which is a really interesting study case for engine engineering because it has 3 cylinders, which is an extremely powerful engine for what it is, because it is making 100 horsepower per cylinder, which is insane. So
Per cylinder.
that would be mean if my vehicle, which has 8 cylinders, was making that same ratio of power, it would be making double the horsepower that it is right now. So it's such a efficient engine. It's such a good study case for that. So, but anyways, if you take a GR Corolla, which has a 3-cylinder engine, and you keep it at 1,000 RPM, which is the rotating assembly making a full revolution 1,000 times a minute, you'll be producing 1,500 explosions a minute. With a 4-cylinder car like a Miata, if you'll rev it at again to 1,000 RPM, you'll be at 2,000. With an inline 5, like what's in early 90s Acura or most Audis, you'll be at 2,500 RPM and so forth. So that is generally the science behind your fundamental note and your secondary note, from my understanding. Here is where we kind of get into some of the harmonics and the timbre that you're talking about, because there are many things that will determine what those intonations are within the engine. There's your piston layout, for example. So you have inline, you have V, you have W, you also have boxer, also known as horizontally opposed. You have I'm sure there are others. These are just kind of the main ones I'm hitting on. Boxer, for example, if anyone doesn't know what it is, generally with an inline motor or slant motor, you have your pistons working together like that. With a boxer motor, they're horizontally opposed, so they're working together like that. And so that's actually why they call them a boxer, because it looks like 2 boxers hitting their hands together. So if you'll notice that a Nissan or a Toyota inline motor or BMW inline motor does not sound the same as a Subaru motor or a Porsche motor, even though this is the same cylinder count, there is reasons for that, and that's one of the reasons the piston layout, because your piston layout determines your combustion chamber, the design. It determines your exhaust, where the intake is coming from, what kind of any number of things can be determined by, first of all, when you're designing an engine, number one thing, you design the combustion chamber. You do that before you do anything else. After you do that, then there's the piston layout, and so that's everything else is a variable. So that's why there are so many variables. So one of these variables is the angle between cylinder banks if you have more than one cylinder banks. So if you have a cylinder bank where the cylinder banks are farther apart, you have one interesting sound. If the pistons are close together, you have different sounds, and most of that is because of vibrations in the engine. We'll get back to that in a minute. You also have, as the revs go up, even with the exact same engine, you have dramatically different sounds because the amount of friction in the engine goes up. And where the phase 1 of the 4-stroke engine, part of it is is the induction, and the way that your throttle body inducts air into it, whether it's laminar flow or turbulent flow, whether it's through one throttle body or two, or whether every single piston that you have has an individual throttle body, like an E46 M3 with the S54, or honestly a lot of naturally aspirated M-cars that BMW manufactures so well have that, and that's going to make a dramatically different effect too. Then you also have stuff like flat plane crankshafts as well as cross plane crankshafts. That's probably like the poster child example that I can come up with for an engine that sounds similar and different due to that one detail. Anyways, and also like the resonator, your exhaust, the way that interprets the sound the engine is producing, that also matters. We kind of touched on that a little bit. So Tony, can you dig in a little bit on why? Okay, so a cross plane engine, that's what most people are familiar with, and a flat plane engine. I can explain why it sounds different, but as far as, can you come up with what are some examples of that, and what is why would someone put a flat plane crank into their car?
So a lot of people will think about cross plane and flat plane as being the two main kinds of crankshafts that cars will have in the engine, and that's mostly because those are the two kinds of crankshafts that are available to us mortals. Once you start getting up, those kinds of crankshafts are very specific to V8 engines or engines that are like multiples of 4, like that. But but like the LFA, for example, uh,
Oh,
does not have a cross plane uh, or a flat plane. But let me take a step back real quick. A cross plane is what you'll find most of the time, and it's whenever the planes of the crankshaft, uh, half of the cylinders will uh, come off of the lobes of a crankshaft this way, and then half of the cylinders will come this way. So they're 90 degrees away, like they are 90 degrees removed from each other. And then a flat plane just looks like this, and half the cylinders are on one side, or half of the what is this called again? The pistons.
yeah,
Half of the half of the pistons exist on one side.
stroke.
No, what is this part? Piston, the arm. What is it called?
Oh
The
yeah,
arm.
yeah. Sorry.
Why am I blanking on this? Why am
Yeah,
I
me
the
too. Yeah,
rods? They're called rods. I don't know.
I'm thinking of
Half of the rods are attached to this end, and half of the rods are attached to this end. What that ends up, what that ends up like, what ends up happening there is you have in the case of a flat plane crank, you have a very symmetrical ish firing order, and so you'll actually end up with two, pistons firing at about the same time on one side, versus uh, in a cross plane crankshaft, whenever two pistons are firing at the same time, they're actually going to be on basically opposite sides of the engine from each other. So that's why with a flat plane crank, like a lot of viewers of a car podcast will be aware, they sound much smoother. They also tend to rev higher, which of course leads to a more smooth sound. Um, but whenever you have a symmetrical-ish firing order like that, then you will have a more pleasing, more race car-y sound. And obviously, you can cut in some sounds of either a flat plane crank race car or a flat plane crank road car. While cross plane cranks like your Corvette, my Corvette, the will have that burble because they have that asymmetrical firing order. And then you can get crazy with the exotic engines that have 10, 12 cylinders, and they'll have 72 degree intervals. These aren't 90 degrees. This isn't 180 degrees. They are tuned to have these specific intervals for, obviously for whatever power purposes that they need to serve. But a lot of the times, uh, these companies spend a lot of money to figure out every bit of the combustion process, what needs to happen to make a certain pleasing sound. Like Yamaha for the Lexus LFA was hired to create that pleasing sound that every car enthusiast knows that the LFA makes.
You raise a great point, and I do want to come back to the LFA, but I do want to kind of interject a little bit with, so part of what makes that burble versus smooth sound is it's and part of why pistons firing at the exact same time opposite ends of each other is a big part of a four-stroke engine is expulsion of the air once you're done with it after the combustion. So that burble that you're talking about with that firing order that Tony was describing, that's literally like kind of like a burp of an engine that's of exhaust gas that's not being efficiently expelled out of the system. So that's why at idle you hear like a blah 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 out of a cross plane, and that's some of the air escaping at an asymmetrical time and at a slight variance, if that makes any sense. Whereas like what Tony said with a flat plane, it's very smooth, like bzzz, almost like a motorcycle engine, or name your Italian sports car that makes their bread and butter on engine sound. So Tony, what about the LFA, other than like obviously there's Yamaha and stuff like that, but what about the LFA makes it sound so iconic?
Can you elaborate on your question?
Yeah, so it's like it has such a haunting sound, and it obviously it sounds different from a V8, it sounds different from V12. what is it about the V10? Is it so, okay, so V10 is just V10 or V12 or V8. For the viewer, think about it as two cylinder banks. If a V8 is two cylinder banks of four cylinders, V10 two cylinder banks of five cylinders. A V12 is two cylinder banks of six cylinders. So you have something like an inline six, for example. An inline six is always going to move its cylinders in pairs as it rotates, which means there's one always in the compression and intake phase, the other way around, intake and compression phase, and then there's another one that's always in the suck squeeze phase, and then the other one that is in the bang blow phase. All that means is that there's always equal and opposite motion, so they're perfectly balanced. That's why inline sixes sound so smooth, and that's why V12s, as basically just a multiple of an inline six, sound so smooth. So when you take two cylinders away, the LFA sounds so dramatic, and it sounds so much more like a cacophony of sound rather than a smooth espresso sound, if that makes any sense. So like, Tony, what about like, does the crankshaft design that you mentioned earlier, what about the LFA, like what's special about that car in terms of that specifically?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, the LFA actually does share a crankshaft. I don't know what to call it, a crankshaft angle to things, to cars like the Murcielago and the Aventador SVJ, both of which are V12 engines, and both of which were specifically like sound designed in a similar way to create a smooth engine note that makes peak power at a very high RPM. So of course the driver is also inclined to rev the car out. Now that cacophony noise that you're talking about is, I mean, like I said, the LFA was almost as hardcore designed to make the noises it does as it was to perform the way that it does. The induction system is actually specially designed to complement the acoustic properties of the rest of the car. It has a resin like surge tank in the induction system to mimic the acoustic chamber of wind instruments. You hear every part of a car. You hear the induction noise, like you said before. You hear you do hear the combustion of the engine even before it leaves the combustion chamber. This is all noise that's happening, and it's all happening on different levels. And so that induction sound was designed to work in tandem with the exhaust sound and in tandem with the way that the engine ticks and stuff. And so it's, it sounds like an orchestra as it screams up to, what is it, like 87 or 9,000 RPM or something like that, like something crazy.
Wild, yeah. Man, that's awesome, man. So that's a great explanation too. So another thing that I have trouble understanding, and I think Jared, you'll be able to shed some of your light as you have so far, is like big cylinder engine or big cylinder count cars, right? So like V8s or V10s or V12s, like anything with 8 or more cylinders, they have a major harmonic, or so I read, at 3 times what the fundamental note is, which gives it a slightly warmer sound than something with less than it. So something like a V6. So for example, take a the W16 from the upcoming Bugatti Tourbillon at the time of this recording, and compare it with a sorry to do this, Tony, a VQ35 out of a 350Z, for example. Those are going to be two.
I'll have some comments on that.
Those are going to be two dramatically different sounds. So what does that mean for something to have a major harmonic at 3 times the fundamental note? Is that what you were expounding on earlier with like the 440 hertz and 880 hertz and stuff like that?
I think maybe a little bit from my understanding, or like with so as I was talking about like the harmonic series and how it starts with like the octave and the fifth, and so for example, if we were to put these notes of the harmonic series on a keyboard and give you like just the straight up note names, so that octaves don't really matter anymore, if we started on C, we would get C and then another C, then G, then C again, and then it starts getting into more diverse sets of notes. But those first 3 or so, the fundamental note and the first 2 or so harmonics, are all fifths and octaves, which are this gets really into music theory and stuff, but in music theory they call them like perfect octaves or perfect fifths and perfect octaves, which are these very specific intervals that, interestingly enough, in like more recent, or it depends on what point in music history, because you get into the weird into like social aspects of everything, but they sound a little more empty. Like when we think of a chord of any kind, like a major chord, there's 3 notes that are involved, which is the bottom note, the root, the third, and the fifth. And I mentioned the fifth there. If you don't have the third in any chord, the difference between major and minor triads or chords is that third. So if you take the third out, you just get the root and the fifth, and it sounds like it could be either, and but it's empty. It's missing that middle thing. And so with the first, my guess is, of course, not knowing like too much about like sound engineering, is that with those first couple of harmonics, you only have the root and the fifth, and so you have less stuff going on, less pitch diversity going on. But when you start adding those additional cylinders and adding those additional harmonics above, that's when we start adding in E and all the, or let's see, after so the harmonic series, it goes C, up an octave C, up a fifth G, up a fourth C, then E, G, B flat, C, D, E, and it starts getting into just a scale when you go really high, which you'd probably need like 24 cylinders or something in order to get all of, or something. So once you start adding those upper harmonics in, it adds in all of the new, or a lot more nuance and like diversity, I guess, to the sound, which makes the timbre that much more, particularly like the idea of shrill. I think one of the articles I was looking into that sort of talked a little bit about the engine sounds, it talked about the LFA, and it pointed out that like it's a really high pitch that it gets, especially, and it compares it to the Audi R8.
Which is also a V10.
Yeah, and it shows. I'll show like what it looks like, because they put the notes on a keyboard to show.
No way!
Whoa!
So
okay. Nice.
If you
What?
They have almost the exact same notes, except the LFA has that one really high thing, because they tuned it to where that it was able to basically, it found the sweet spot where it could pull out that extremely large, like, I'm trying to think of how I describe it, like a fifth or sixth or a high harmonic. And so so somehow they were able to find that sweet spot. And yeah, so I guess that's how they did it. The article, for those who want to check it out, because it has like a nice mix of like what's going on here, is on carthrottle.com. And it's, let's see, they say the article's name is "A Musician's Analysis of Engine Notes."
Oh yeah, I grazed that. I grazed that article when studying for this episode. Yeah.
And while things, I hesitate. I don't necessarily, in my own personal biases, like the idea of just putting everything on a keyboard. It helps make it relatable, but at the same time, one of the interesting things about considering sound by frequency instead of by pitch notes is when we're looking at a keyboard, this gets into social stuff. That's like Europe decided we wanted to stick with 12 notes on a keyboard or whatever. But if we look at frequency, there's 18,000 different frequencies we can look at to say, or even if we were just going with whole numbers, 18,000 different frequencies where we could say, or not 18,980, 19,980 different frequencies we could use. But either way,
I didn't know that at all. I don't
it's a little bit off topic, but it's something that is one thing that I think is interesting about music tech. But yeah, so that high pitch is probably, they found the sweet spot. They found the physical chamber they needed to make sure that harmonic that's octaves above the fundamental note is just really amplified.
Yeah.
Which is
so
cool.
fascinating. Yeah, that's awesome. And that's so cool, because that just explaining the science behind why something sounds so good is huge, because it's not that I intentionally take it for granted, or that anyone really takes it for granted, but like there's so much character that goes into a car, specifically its sound. And it's, and it's honestly really encouraging as a car enthusiast to know that there are people who have enough influence over cars being made that they can say, hey, let's spend a bunch of time into making this intentionally like pleasurable to hear, and that's really cool. So
seeing labors of love in the small details is always really comforting.
And labor of love is an excellent way to describe that, because the LFA did nothing but lose money for Lexus. Like
literally every single one sold lost money.
it was just, I think I saw, I don't know, this is an original thought. It is not an original thought. I think I saw this somewhere, but like the Lexus LFA was Lexus coming to the table of other supercar makers and say, hey, just so you know, if we wanted to, we would, and like, I think that's such a good depiction of that car. And in some ways it's underrated, in other ways it's overrated, but it's really interesting to see that, like, wow, the engineering was not overrated. Another thing about car sound is this goes a little bit or way out of probably any of our expertise, but I think there's some speculation to be made about what we as humans find pleasing, and that maybe comes from nature more than nurture, as far as like we might associate big low rumbles, we might associate that with power or something like that, and so when we hear something that's just like, it just like, you just feel it in your chest. It feels like it's you hear an old muscle car line up at an eighth of a mile or drag strip, and it feels like it's going to rip the ground off of it, off of the tires, and you just, that's a visceral response. That's, you're no longer thinking like, yes, I am thinking. I'm not making fun of you, but you're no longer thinking like, yes, the octaves and the synchronicity of this is very pleasing. You're thinking
No,
like,
that's fair.
holy shit, this is a dinosaur and it's about to like, it's about to come alive.
Yeah, in the moment when you listen to music or hear sound, you think this makes me feel
Right.
good.
And I think that's the beauty of the perspective that you bring to the table, Jared, is like, you know you understand that as a musician, and also as someone, extremely well versed, no pun intended, in music, that like, yes, this is, humans have an emotional response to the way that things sound.
Oh, I get it. Well
Yeah.
versed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're able to explain and identify why, and I think that's really cool. And another thing too is like, I don't exactly know why the higher something revs, the better it sounds to me. I don't fully understand that, and I'm not asking questions. Like, the times that I've driven a Shelby GT350, which revs over 8,000 RPM, and the times that I've driven a E46 M3, which also revs over 8,000 RPM, those are the hallmark engines to me because of the way it makes me feel in that moment. And that's,
I'm. Oh, go
oh, I was
ahead.
just
Go
gonna say,
ahead.
like, I just cannot get over, the way that they sound when it revs that high. Not only, okay, and it's not just the sound, it's the fact that when you have an engine that revs that high, it makes you work for the torque, which for a car enthusiast like myself or Tony, if you're interacting with a car, a huge point, a huge capital letter in the letter that you are reading between you and the car is this engaging, and how is this vehicle interacting with me, interacting with it in the road. The car makes it possible, the driver makes it happen, right? And so when you have a car that revs higher and it makes you work for the torque, you really have to converse and argue and persuade the car to do what you want it to do. And this is something that is not present in every single car. The most consumer cars en masse, it's meant to be easy points of appliances, and there's nothing wrong with that. We have an entire episode about that specifically. But when you get into a car that really feels alive and you have to pay attention to, like, it grabs you by the collar and says, hey, I'm not going to give you all of my torque, and you have to force it out of them. There's nothing like it. Like, there's nothing like it. There, you can have all the horsepower you want. If it's, if you're not having to work for it, you're going to go back to the car, and you're going to go back to the experience that makes you feel something. And this is something mine and Tony's Miata is currently living with me. And it is really kind of brain breaking to have something with 3 times the horsepower, but it doesn't feel like the Miata. And conversely, like, there's just, I think, a huge point of cars, to go a little bit philosophical, is um, a really good car makes you want to misbehave. A really, really good car misbehaves, and you have to deal with it. And and I think an engine is paramount for that. Especially one that revs high, especially one that's characterful, and one that just really makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. But what were you gonna say, Tony?
Oh, I was going. You were talking about how just the concept of a higher revving car, sound. There's just like the extra,
Yeah.
the extra something, the extra chutzpah to it,
Yeah.
and and it reminds me of. I mean, and obviously, this may be relevant to something that you could touch on, Jared, but uh I've been studying lately on how, like, what goes, like, how to write a good guitar solo. And mind you, I am not super well versed in music theory. I've made a conscious effort in the past couple of years to understand it better, but I have no formal training. But what does make a good guitar solo is, um, and you'll notice this if you know listen to a lot of a lot of rock music or music that um, involves a guitar that becomes the spotlight for a moment, and there's something that our brain really likes, and this applies to orchestra music as well. But there's something about our brain really likes as a musical piece, or certain sounds like increase in pitch as it goes along, and
like a
comes
crescendo?
to
Is that what it is?
comes to a high, like a crescendo of some sort, or a
Okay.
but most solos will start, in the middle, or 2/3 of the way up the guitar neck, and then end slightly like at the top of the guitar neck, or slightly higher. Just because our brains really like that build up. It's almost like character development. It's like that build up of sound, ending in, like I said, a crescendo. And as far as cars go, as far as cars revving goes, obviously I'm speaking to that as well. But there's probably something in there, and this is kind of a guess, but there's probably something in there to the fact that, like in music, you have chords that resolve, and it's really satisfying when chords resolve even higher. And whenever you have whenever you're accelerating in a car and you're shifting gears, you're not starting at 0 RPM. You're starting,
Mhm.
especially if you're at full beans, around 3,000 RPM, probably,
Yeah.
at the next gear. And that doesn't quite resolve, where most cars have their next shift point, which is somewhere between 6 and 7,000.
Mhm.
But whenever you reach those more exotic, more exotic revolutions, like 8 to 9 to 9,500
Yeah.
RPM, then there's something in there that complements that 3,000 from earlier much nicer. And then there's just a simple fact of that you don't hear cars revving that high that often.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I think I agree. An important part of music, to get to also get a little philosophical about it, music is a temporal art form. Like the reason why we consider music to be music is because it is something, it's sound organized over time. And in order to make something compelling to view over time, more generally, you need it to develop. And generally, we see things as getting more tense and more active as it gets higher pitched and as it gets louder. And so often, guitar solos will start out like something lower and maybe something simple, and then they'll start building up, or maybe they'll even like kind of wander around a little bit. But as they build up, they go, yeah. Then they'll start going up more consistently. I think of like a lot of the tapping guitar solos where they go and then they start going higher and higher and higher and higher and higher.
Mhm.
Of course, there's always, and one thing with music in all art forms is that like you make the rules to break the rules, and there's always going to be something that's different and doesn't follow this order and is actually just a chill guitar solo the whole time, but it's still the coolest thing you ever heard. So there's always exceptions, but
Yeah, like Comfortably Numb
Yeah.
is an ambient song. That's really what it is. It's an ambient song, and there's two solos in that song, and neither of them have that insane. It's all about feel, So they don't follow that, the we need to go scream super high, like kind of. It's kind of solo, but then you listen to that Van Halen, who loves to just fly up the guitar neck as he writes a solo. Like,
Yeah.
obviously, like Eruption is just one long solo, or any virtuoso stuff like Satriani or Vai. They will have a section 2/3 of the way where they will almost always just like scream, and they're at the 22nd or 24th fret sometimes.
And to go along with like engine revving and stuff like that, I think the novelty of like going that high, I think a combination of that, as well as that being a wider range than you would normally get, I imagine, than like the other things. That means your brain is like, yes, this is going further and harder than I'm used to, and that's a dopamine rush, I imagine.
Oh,
This is great, Jared. You've been huge in this.
Oh, well, thanks. It's fun, and yeah, y'all are it's interesting stuff. I like hearing the perspectives. There's like all the different intricacies about cars that I like. I know it's complicated in there, but I don't know. how, I mean, I could never comprehend without many more years of experience that as like y'all have all the like ways that it can be complicated and the nice changes that can be
Yeah.
made and the reasons why. So it's always cool.
I mean, we barely understand ourselves. This is not a heavy topic in the in the car culture world. It's just like you like these sounds or you don't. But no, but this is not a conversation that
Yeah.
happens almost ever. You know, you'll find a couple interesting YouTube videos on it. But the musicality of engines is not like it's not talked about like geometry is a big conversation in the car world because that makes you go faster. But though the kind of conversations that happen when it comes to making a car sound what it sounds like almost is like 90% of the time is going to happen in a boardroom because they want to sell that sound. They don't need people to talk about it.
Genuinely, like that's fantastic insight too, as far as to like the technical and the emotional side of engines and sound and stuff like that. But yeah, but we haven't really talked about exhaust that much. So
No, the exhaust is where all the magic happens, right? Where all the actual
yeah, right.
sound comes out. And there can be, I mean, you can talk about the length, like how mufflers work and stuff like that. I'm not on the forefront of muffler technology, but one of the biggest subjects that comes up whenever people talk about like the actual sound of a car is and like Subaru people might be able to speak on this more because a lot of other cars do not have this quote unquote concern. But the one of the biggest conversations in the Subaru world is equal length versus unequal length headers, and some people hear that and like understands what that means at like on a surface level. I think people can intuit that just objectively an equal length header car is going to be more efficient in scavenging exhaust from the engine and then piping it to the rest of the exhaust manifold or the exhaust system.
Mhm.
Most cars are going to have a relatively equal exhaust system coming from all four or eight or six or whatever cylinders leading to the rest of the exhaust system. But like, what does that mean when it comes to the sound? Because when people change from the factory unequal length header system in a Subaru to an equal length header system in a Subaru, either they're chasing power or they're chasing a better tone. Regardless, the tone changes, the sound changes. One of the like a Subaru versus a Porsche, which also shares that boxer engine architecture, sound completely different. A 911, like pretty much, I mean, honestly, almost pick your fighter. A 911 is going to be one of the best sounding cars out on the road and one of the most exotic.
Absolutely.
And they never have more than six cylinders. I mean, well, almost never. There, of course, are
Yeah.
some that do, but there are four-cylinder and six-cylinder boxer engine Porsches that do not ever sound in the same universe as a Subaru, as just your factory like STI or whatever that you get from the lot. And Subaru, and I don't know, I don't 100% know if it's because of packaging or if they were going for that different sound, but most like WRXs and STIs will come with an unequal length header system from the factory. And a lot of the times it comes down to packaging. It's cheaper and easier to package an unequal length header system in a boxer engine uh, just because you're so crammed in the engine bay and then
Right.
leaving the engine bay. And so buying a nice equal length header system for your Subaru is, I mean, in my opinion, it makes it sound better. Uh, but why does that? Why do those things exist? Because
Mhm.
if you actually look at the whole range of even exotic cars, sometimes you do get equal length and unequal length uh, header systems. Like you have a Maybach with a V12. You have a Pagani with the same V12, well, almost the same V12, with a very similar V12 with a very similar architecture. I have had the pleasure to drive a couple of Maybachs. I've never driven a Pagani, unfortunately. But I am acutely aware that a Maybach does not sound like a Pagani, and of course, the engine sound coming from a Maybach is much more is much more deadened, so you hear it less. But it's not just the volume that's deadened; it's the actual aggressiveness of the tone. A Maybach actually has unequal length headers versus a Pagani that has equal length headers. With a Pagani, they're chasing they're chasing the efficient scavenging, of course, and they're chasing a nice screaming tone. If you
I don't think
obviously
any of
remove the
them.
muffler from a Maybach, it's going to be louder, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's still not going to sound like a Pagani. Now take the headers off, put equal length headers on the Maybach, then you're going to have the world's slowest F1 car. I think that specific line I think I stole from Jason Camisa, that world's slowest F1 car line. But if you go onto YouTube and search,
Really?
like, not even, it doesn't even have to be a Maybach. It can be any V12 S class from the past. It's just
Yeah.
that most tend to be Maybachs. But look up a S600 or a Maybach S680 with no with custom. They're generally going to be custom headers, because no aftermarket company in their right mind would spend any money developing headers for
That's crazy. Yeah.
obscenely expensive luxury car. But it's just gonna you will see it roll by the camera. A lot of the videos that I see are just like really shitty videos. But you'll see it roll. You'll see this car shaped thing roll by the camera, and it is absolutely screaming. It sounds like the F1 cars from the '90s. It is insane. And there's some there, while the Subarus like have that burble because of the unequal length headers, you can engineer that to make it. It's not a smoother sound. It's just less of a. It's just a less harsh sound or less aggressive tone. And I personally can speak to that sort of thing because I have two vehicles, I should say, that have the same size engine but have wildly different characteristics as far as tone goes. I have a 2004 350Z, which a lot of people will say is the worst sounding enthusiast car almost ever. And I don't disagree. I don't like how my 350Z sounds. I'm not going to get rid of it. That car I'm keeping for life. I love that car. But the sound of it, like, people in car culture know that that once a VQ, a loud VQ guy shows up to the meet or the racetrack, you're gonna have to put your earplugs in.
Okay, I don't want to cut you off for just a second for a funny anecdote. Last month, when the one track that you missed, I had two different people come up, because they know like you and I are buddies. Two different people come up and be like, "I miss Tony, but damn, I'm glad I don't hear that car."
It doesn't help that I keep getting exhaust leaks every time I go out, because either one of my O2 sensor bungs come out, or this most recent time my muffler literally ripped off of one of the hangers, and it created a hole in the muffler that sound is now farting out of. I get it. But this is a 3.5-liter V6. I have another 3.5-liter V6 in the form of my F-150 sitting outside as well, and that
wildly different sounds.
And I mean, imagine if I had to tow with a V6 with a VQ35 sound like droning in my ear, I'd fucking throw myself off a cliff.
Yeah.
I'd jump out of the car and let myself get run over by the trailer. It would be insane.
Yeah.
So how did Ford counteract this?
Right,
Obviously, they are fundamentally different vehicles with different sizes of exhaust, but it's the same size engine with the same degree of crankshaft, and they're both 60-degree V6s, science says that they should sound pretty similar. And if the 350Z comes factory with, and I currently have aftermarket headers, but they're also equal length headers. It comes factory with equal length headers. For it with an F-150, they they engineered a very specific unequal length header like situation
Yeah.
to make the and of course it's a less loud vehicle in general. But even Raptors don't sound like shit, you know.
Yeah.
But it's a much less excuse Whew. Excuse me. It's a much more almost Maybach-ish situation where they wanted to make it as less aggressive as possible, or as non-aggressive as possible, versus the 350Z. They wanted an aggressive sounding car.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And another thing to think about too is like there's also different express purposes too. Like, okay, so I had a Nissan Xterra and for a long time, and I towed with it, and it was a VQ40 DE, which is very similar to the VQ35 DE, but it's I can speak a little bit of with towing with the VQ and just the intricacies of different use cases for cars as well, because you're going to have a different bore and stroke for some engines, you're going to have a different torque curve and power curve, you're going to have different headers, as you said, and different insulation levels that go into different things. And you can have, to Tony's point, two seemingly identical engines at face value, but when you really get into the nuts and bolts of it, pun intended this time, you'll find that there's plenty of engineering that goes into why something sounds the way it does. And yeah, I think that's probably a really good place to kind of taper off a little bit. My final thoughts on this would be, I'm not saying that engine sound has to be important to you as a car enthusiast. This is something that is paramount to me, but like I said, I'm outdated. I'm kind of old school in that way. I also like gears, or I also like gears that don't change themselves, and that's been slower for a long time now. But the point of a car is not how good it is as much as it is how does it make you feel, and sometimes it being good at something is what makes you feel something, and that's good. So and that's okay. That's EVs definitely have a place for enthusiasts that like them. But there are a lot of hours, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that go into the way that something sounds. And if you find yourself just drawn or magnetized or catalyzed by the way that something sounds, it is not an accident. There is science that goes into it. There's emotion that goes into it. And that is one of the very best things to me about this great big wide world of cars that we live in. And so I think that's a really cool thing. Jared, what's been like the coolest thing that you've learned, or that you've been able to, or that the most fun thing that you've talked about, or the most fun thing that you've learned?
Yes, Doctor, how have we illuminated you?
Dr. Sound.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, there's just, I think I was, I think everyone knows that engines are complex things and cars are complex things. But as somebody who, in all honesty, as somebody who needed to like Google a diagram of an engine to see like, okay, this is what a crankshaft is before like about a day ago.
Yeah.
Then like, it's just, it's cool to, I love seeing intricate things and knowing the labors of love that went into it. And,
yeah.
So like every single detail of being like, oh yeah, there's this version of this, but also there's like 5 more. And then you're not considering aftermarket and custom things that can be done.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that's like just for one part, like the headers then versus like every other aspect of it. It's just everything is kind of possibly customizable, but also has been engineered both for the sake of efficiency, but also in a way that often ties in, because I mean, if things are more efficient, they tend to have more or less of a certain sound. And then that certain sound, because of its efficiency or inefficiency, tends to be like, even to tie it into sound one more time, I guess, like when we think of vinyls sounding warmer compared to like CDs and stuff, one of the reasons for that is that it's an analog sound, which is like saying it's like you're directly reading from the grooves in the vinyl compared to like a CD where it's all digital ones and zeros that are being reinterpreted by a speaker. But that warm sound comes from the imperfections and comes from the differences that happen as just a part of existing as a physical medium in this world. And so I guess maybe partially for me, and partially for whoever else is listening and feels like maybe they don't have the car that they would be of their dreams.
Mhm.
I mean, it's cool to think that every single car has its own unique sound because of the
Right.
way that it's a physical thing that exists. And so I think there's something nice to think that there's like it's every your car is unique because you're driving it and no one else has driven it the way you have.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely. Yeah, and
So-
a cool thing too is that like we just talked about mainly naturally aspirated engines and the hardware. We didn't even talk about the tuning. We didn't even talk about forced induction or like any induction other than normal aspiration. And but I think the point shines through. You raise a great point of this, as much as I think about sound and as much as I pay attention to and obsess over and sometimes hate and sometimes love engine noise, it's refreshing to see that it is a big wide world, and I didn't even know how sound worked before 30 minutes ago. And so what about you, Tony? Did you know how sound worked 30
No, I
minutes?
didn't know how sound worked. That's what I'm saying.
Oh man. But
Join us next time where we talk about how T-Pain literally made a song with the blub of a rotary.
well, thank you guys so much for watching with us. This is a bit of a long one, but I think it's just from recording it now, it's probably one of my favorite pieces that we've done so far. I've learned a lot. I hope you guys have as well, and I'm excited to tune in with you all next time. All right, bye guys.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.